We'll make it live.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Rich.
Right. Okay.
Minute. All right. Yeah. All right. All right. Bye.
Mark, did you call Rich?
I called him.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and we'll get started. Thank you guys so much for joining us this afternoon. We wanted to make sure that Janice and Christina had a chance to walk through what the audit will look like for next year and go through their PowerPoints. Oh, and I also wanted to introduce, she's on the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. Jenny Jenkins will be our new Director of Finance. She'll be replacing Lisa Fury. So I wanted her to be on here so that she could get a handle and see what was going on with this. So she's going to be a great addition. She's been in the auditing business for 8 to 10 years and just brings some great experience. So we're very excited to have her join. Janice, I'm going to go ahead, unless there are any other questions, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen and you can go ahead and start your presentation.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay.
So again, we wanted to thank you for the opportunity to not only continue to serve the special school district, but also to meet with you today and go over some of the planning aspects of the audit. Before I go all the way, keep going, let me just take a minute to introduce or reintroduce myself to you. You all look familiar to me, and Christina as well. I'll give her a second as well to talk about her experience, but I've served the school district as the manager director for the last 3 years, as well as being involved in various portions of the audit in years prior to that. I'm the audit department. I run the audit department at Showalter and Jabori as well, and have over 25 years of experience in the government and not-for-profit and public accounting area. Christina, do you want to take just a second to reintroduce yourself?
Sure, Janice. So my name is Christina Jaquin. Some of you may know me from the past. I've been at Showalter and Jabori since 2008 and involved in the special school district audit in some form or another since 2008, really. Some years I've been the audit senior on it, some years manager. The last few years it's been Janice, but I'm transitioning back onto the team. So I'm excited to be working with everyone again.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Next slide, please. So here is an outline of the items that we'd like to talk about today. As professional standards require, is that we have a communication in the planning phases and the reporting phases, but specifically right now, the planning phases of the audit. The intent is to have an effective two-way communication with you. So although there's things that I'm required to communicate and to talk about, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to interrupt, or we'll definitely make time at the end. So whatever is best for you, please don't hesitate. Last week, you should have been forwarded an actual communication letter that goes over some things like scope and timing and some items, but we wanted just to have the opportunity to talk a little bit more in depth with you on those items. So during our presentation today, as noted here in the outline, we will discuss the scope of the audit services, the timeline in conducting the audit. We'll review the audit process in the area of audit emphasis. We'll have some fraud consideration discussions and discuss some new and emerging accounting pronouncements. At some point, probably in the future, we will reach out to the committee just with regards to our required fraud communication. That's just something we have to have with various individuals and the committee at some point during the course of the audit. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're required to communicate certain things to you and to try to collaborate or have some communication with you in case you have any concerns to bring to our attention as well. We will go over the plan, scope, and timing of the engagement in the next few slides. Our responsibilities under generally accepted auditing standards, which are stated in our engagement letter, is to express an opinion about whether the financial statements that are prepared by management with the oversight of this committee are fairly presented in all material respects in conformity with US GAAP. Our audit doesn't relieve the committee or management of their duties with regards to the financial statements. Our responsibilities over the supplementary information that accompany the financial statements is to evaluate, that presentation in relation to the financial statements as a whole. So we've been engaged to perform a financial statement audit in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, government auditing standards, and the Uniform Grant Guidance. And our engagement, therefore, will result in the issuance of various reports. We'll issue an opinion on the GAAP financial statements that are prepared by management. We'll issue a report on internal control over financial reporting and compliance and other matters in accordance with government auditing standards. And we'll also issue a report on compliance for each major federal program as required by the Uniform Grant Guidance. We're also required to communicate certain things to this committee at the conclusion of an audit. So we'll issue that report and communicate any recommendation or advisory comments that we identified during the course of our audit. Next slide. The timeline noted herein has been established based upon discussions with management, and we're working very closely with them to ensure their readiness and responsiveness, as well as our timely turnaround during the audit in relation to audit and reporting requests and responsibilities. We've discussed with management the targeted timetable here and changes that they've implemented in order to accelerate the closing processes and procedures. In order to have information reconciled, reviewed, and final prior to the start of the audit, or with a few exceptions shortly thereafter. We'll be meeting regularly with management regarding the status of open requests, questions, et cetera, to help quickly identify and address any delays. We'll work with management if the situation arises of anything that is outside the scope of the audit and would require any kind of change order. But there will be daily status touch points during audit field work, both interim and final, and open communication outside of those weeks as both teams prepare for and conclude the audit. The timeline here listed, we're obviously but right now we're taking place in this audit committee meeting. We have our preliminary audit field work scheduled for the week of June 21st. Final field work begins the week of September 13th, and then the presentation to the audit committee and the board is targeted for late October. Next slide. With regards to our current year audit process, we place a strong emphasis on understanding and confirming or updating our understanding of how your entity functions. This involves a review of internal controls to assess the nature, timing, and extent of the audit procedures we're going to perform. We also consider various fraud risk factors by not only having internal discussions among team members and brainstorming around possible fraud considerations, but we also have interviews, as I mentioned, with this committee, with management, and with district staff with regards to those considerations. We use all that information to help develop the audit plan for our audit. We will focus during field work on the higher risk areas, which will be on another slide. As I mentioned, we have regular status updates with management to help keep everything online and focused. And at the conclusion of the work, we will have representations that we receive from management regarding the integrity and the completeness of the information they provided to us. This engagement, like all of our engagements, will be subject to a quality review. And at the conclusion of the audit, as I mentioned, we'll present to the audit committee and the board of education. Next slide. So based upon our experience with special school district and with other school districts, we have concluded here, these being the areas of audit emphasis. They include cash, revenues, receipts, disbursements, capital assets, federal programs with an extra special emphasis on the CARES Act money that will be, new as far as an audit requirement in the current year, but will be something we expect to be testing as a major program. State and compliance reporting, as well as looking at accounting judgments, policies, and estimates. Next slide. Every audit must include some kind of assessment of fraud risk. For an auditor, this relates to material fraud, something that would be considered material or significant, and also relates to the financial statements. Obviously, there's a lot of kinds of fraud out there that the school district has to be concerned about, but when we're talking about fraud, that's what we're focused on. In that regard, there's two types of fraud. There is the fraudulent financial reporting, where something is intentionally misstated in the financial statements. And then there's the misappropriation of assets. So some theft of an entity's assets so that the financial statements are therefore misstated because of that. Research has indicated that there is something called a fraud triangle, that 3 elements actually have to be present for fraud to exist. First, there has to be an incentive or pressure, which gives someone the reason to commit fraud. There has to be an opportunity, which is usually the lack of controls or ineffective controls that enable a person to commit fraud. And then there's an attitude or a rationalization that they use to justify doing something that is fraudulent. Again, usually all 3 of these have to exist in order for fraud to occur. As far as an auditor's responsibility regarding fraud, we are required to plan and perform the audit to obtain a reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements are free of material misstatement, whether caused by error or fraud. As I mentioned before, we do various procedures, and we use that to consider all the information that we gather as to what the scope and the extent of our procedures should be for the audit. Next slide. With regards to independence requirements, auditors performing engagements under generally accepted government auditing standards such as this are subject to some new rules that enforce the principles of transparency and accountability under revisions that were published by the U.S. Government Accountability Office. If you've ever heard of government auditing standards or the Yellow Book, that is what I'm referring to. One of the main updates related to this has to do with the independence standards. Among other things, it indicates that and clarifies that a firm, an accounting and auditing firm that is preparing accounting records or financial statements, whether in their entirety or even just certain sections or portions of the financial statements for an audit client, that creates a threat to independence that requires the firm to apply safeguards in order to maintain our independence. So the firm must document and evaluate the threat that might exist if we're providing this kind of assistance, the safeguards that we have implemented, and then how those threats were effectively addressed by those safeguards. The reason I bring this up is because it is the responsibility of management as well as the firm to ensure that our independence is maintained in such situations. We've had discussions already with management regarding this guidance and the safeguards that would be necessary in order to ensure that independence is maintained. But I just wanted to make sure that the committee was aware of this new guidance that's out there. Before I go on, I was going to have Christina talk a little bit about the emerging guidance for the audit. Is there any questions on anything I've said so far?
Yeah, Janice, what steps will you take in auditing of the CARES Act funding?
Well, actually, Christina can probably speak to that a little bit better. Maybe if you want to go through, Christina, you can talk to that and then go through your standards. We've had some testing already for some of our clients with the CARES Act. Some of it is dependent on what money you've received and how you've used it, but Christina can probably speak best to some of that information.
Right. We've seen, probably we're talking about ESSER, I'm imagining, with CARES. I know there's lots of pieces of CARES and things have come from all kinds of different buckets, but it seems like the majority of money that school districts are seeing is ESSER funds. We've audited it at least 1 or 2 places in the prior fiscal year as well. And we're going to probably be auditing it a lot this upcoming fiscal year. So in our experience, depending, again, like Janice said, depends on what the district spent the money on. One option was to apply the funds to salaries, and another option is to purchase equipment. So, you know, I've seen technology being purchased and salaries. So if there was salaries applied to that, we would test that like we would test our usual federal program, which is the special ed cluster. We'd look at who the money was spent on, ensuring that their salaries were authorized and appropriate and that they were reasonable and necessary for the administration of the federal program. The same side of the coin really on accounts payable type expenditures if there were any. So making sure that purchases are in line with allowability requirements and that they are following the internal controls established by the school district.
Okay.
So that's what we're seeing as far as ESSER so far. And again, we'll have more detailed conversations with management and kind of learn more about what special school district did with those funds.
We have provided management with, as we do every year, a client request list for various items, but then particular to this year, we provided a preliminary list related to CARES Act. We know we'll have to add to it based upon once we start finding some things out, but we have provided that to management to start gathering some of the information, and we'll be talking to them more specifically about it during our interim procedures so that we can plan what we really do need to do, and they can start grabbing the information.
Yeah, and the unique thing about CARES is that it was so rushed on an emergency basis. I mean, it was needed because things happen so quickly. There really isn't a lot of requirements yet. Like some of the older federal programs that have been around a while have a ton of compliance requirements. With CARES, there was really a lot of leeway in that. And the guidance for auditing it came out after funds were spent. So, you know, it's been a challenge, of course, but I think by now, you know, there's new guidance from OMB, there's guidance from DESE, and I think we're learning more about it. So, yeah.
Do you have any other questions at this point, or go ahead and go to the next slide?
I do have a question, if you don't mind. Hi, Scott Muller here. I'm kind of new to this scene, so forgive me. I'm on a learning curve. I have some I'm a classroom teacher through much of my career. I am curious, can you speak to when there's bidding for contracts for construction work? I've heard some feedback over the years that in education, that construction firms find it easy, and it's an easier target to collude, to elevate bidding and prices because there's less scrutiny of their work and so on. How can you speak to some of that? Is that something that you've experienced, and how do you handle that?
Well, I guess my first answer would be, as it relates to what falls within the scope of the audit, we would only be looking at construction because of where you're spending federal money. A lot of times it's not in something that is considered a major program, so it wouldn't fall under something that's specifically being audited. Certainly when we look at, we do procedures over payables and things like that, we're seeing that things are being spent as they should be and as they were, you know, contracted for, but we're not doing a deep dive into the whole bidding process as part of the audit. It's something that we could do as outside the scope if you had a concern over things. It's certainly, I mean, part of what we're here to do is to meet the needs that the audit committee sees that there might be, and that's something we could talk about, scoping a different kind of work, but that type of bidding process isn't something that would typically fall under a school district's audit scope.
Okay, thank you.
Again, unless it was a lot of federal money, and so it was falling under a major program that was being tested, and we were trying to test with regards to the federal guidelines.
Okay.
Yeah, and to that effect, I would say, you know, construction, it's hard to speak to the firms that are responding to bids, but I think your best defense against getting crummy bids or getting some, maybe if you're having firms that are kind of colluding with each other, is just to make it as available as possible for other firms to bid on it. Make your requests for proposals as detailed as, like, demand quality. You know, I've seen a wide range of requests for proposals that honestly look pretty generic and they don't have a lot of requirements. And if you want these people to get the job, basically, I mean, I would demand excellence from them in requests for proposals. And I think that might weed out some of that.
Yeah. And Christina, that's a great point, because we just had a bid opening Friday for roofing. We have a third-party advisor consultant who reviews those bids. So he's looking at them from a perspective of, is that cost correct? Is that bid accurate? So there's a couple different things we've put in place that ensure, a competitive process with the bids.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions right now, or?
Yeah, Janice, this is Joyce. I have one more question. Do you expect that your field work is going to be on site or virtual? I'm not sure, where you all are and where SSD staff is at the moment, but if you could, maybe speak to that a little bit, and then how you handled things last year, and what, how that changes your process, if at all.
Sure. So we have had discussions with management already. As far as our office policy right now is to still do all of our work remotely. Considering and kind of just cutting to the chase, if you consider what we do, we go to a lot of different places. And so our firm's risk quality, risk management group has determined that the safest thing for both our people and for all these places we would be visiting is still to remain basically remotely. From an audit perspective, if you also consider what we do, we've always worked remotely. We either work remote, if we're at a client, we're remote from the office. If we're at the office, we're remote from a client. So we've had that's kind of been part of what an auditor always does. We carry our bag with us. We have all that information. So last year, obviously, we did 100% all of our audits remote. We have definitely some best practices as far as trying to have daily status meetings with, internal and external meetings to help keep things running. We have a portal for the, safe and secure transfer of documents. Now, that being said, so interim, which is only a week, not a week, but about a month away, is planned at this point to be remote. My hope is that by year end, we can have some kind of at least a hybrid situation where we come in for just a couple days, a couple days a week, where we can do some of the more like document intensive things so that it can free up some of the district's time to not have to put those things on the portal. And we can have some of those harder conversations that maybe can't be facilitated via Zoom as well. But then we can, when by working remotely, we're still in our offices. So our team is together asking questions and getting through things. But that would be, the intention. If things can't be fully open by the fall timeframe, to at least be able to do some kind of hybrid situation.
Thank you.
Okay, Christina, you want to go ahead with the next few slides?
Sure. So next we're going to talk about, there's a lot of new Gatsby standards that are coming out. Gatsby's been busy the past few years. Effective this fiscal year for 2021, there are two that I wanted to talk about. The first is Gatsby 84. It's fiduciary activities. It improves the guidance for identifying and reporting fiduciary activities. The main component relates to agency funds. Agency funds are no longer named agency funds. They're custodial funds, and the criteria for them have been changed slightly. We don't expect this will have a large impact on the district because they don't currently have any agency funds, but we wanted to make the committee aware that it's out there. Same with Gatsby 93. This is the replacement of interbank offered rates. Tends to relate to agreements that are tied to IBORs, or more specifically LIBOR is a common one. Again, portions of this guidance are to be implemented now, but others not until next fiscal year. Currently, we don't think the district has much applicability to this, but again, in the future, you never know what might happen. And as noted by the asterisks that you'll see on the slide, a lot of these standards were originally due to be implemented earlier than this year, but they were delayed by the issuance of Gatsby Statement 95, which was issued in May of 2020 as a response to COVID-19 pandemic. So that standard delayed the implementation of a lot of Gatsbys. Next slide, please. So looking ahead to next year, fiscal year 2022, there are 3 standards that are going to be applicable. The largest one and the one of most importance that I'd like to highlight would be Gatsby 87. 87 will certainly be effective for special school district. It relates to leases. GASB 87 establishes a single model for lease accounting based on the foundational principle that leases are financings of the right to use an underlying asset. So assets that were previously classified as operating leases will now be required to be reported as lease assets and lease liabilities on the balance sheet. So this is a change from traditional GASB accounting. The district currently does have operating leases for various office equipment and buildings. And it may apply to change the criteria for some of the current capital leases as well. So that's the big one for next year. There's also GASB 92, which is an omnibus standard. GASB issues those from years to years just to kind of update comparability in accounting and financial reporting, improving consistency and that kind of stuff. These are effective for FY22. In GASB 97, this primary objective is to improve the consistency in the reporting of fiduciary component units and certain pension and OPEB plans. We don't think this will have much impact on the school district as you don't have any fiduciary component units. And the way that OPEB and pensions works in Missouri, this doesn't really apply to, but we did want to make you aware of it, that it's out there. Next slide, please.
If I can interject for a second, back on the other slide, and you don't have to move back, but with regards to GASB 87, those who have been around will know that we've been talking about this for a long time. It's been out there since June of 2017. And I know the advice we have been given for years has been that the first thing that any district needs to do is to get a listing or a tracking of all their leases and make sure you have documents, the agreements and everything, because it's going to take the time. You're going to have to comb through those in order to determine how to, what value to give these right to use and to give the liabilities and what have you. So the best thing that you can be doing if you haven't already is to get that complete listing of leases pulled together and to make sure you have the agreements that support them, not just summaries or what have you, because some of this is going to get into the details of the documents.
Would that affect the accounting for the leases, sort of the intercompany lease with the Missouri Facilities Authority?
Yes, that will apply to that too. So it's quite a standard. There is guidance out there from GASB. They have implementation guides that are typically pretty helpful and Q&As. So we got a delay for a year because of COVID-19, but it's coming. So, projecting out to fiscal year 2023, there's only really two that I wanted to mention. GASB 94 is related to guidance regarding various partnerships and arrangements, typically those with a third party. I don't think special school district has much of this. Again, we wanted to just make the committee aware of it. And GASB 96 is interesting. That provides guidance on identifying, recording, and disclosing subscription-based technology arrangements. So this is going to be cloud computing arrangements, promoting consistency and comparability among entities. So that's 2023. Of the next 3 years of the GASBs, I would say GASB 87 is probably the one that's the highlight that I think is going to have the biggest impact on the district. I guess next slide, please. And that concludes our presentation as we have planned. But again, we are happy to take this time to answer any questions the committee has, or hear anything that anybody wants to communicate.
Janice, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
For the meeting today, are you going to want us to stop live streaming early so you can talk to the committee in private?
That would be helpful. I mean, that would be probably the most efficient way to be able to have the, kind of that part of the meeting
Okay.
we typically have. That would be great.
Okay, well, let me know when it's time for that, and then we'll stop the live streaming.
If there aren't any other questions, it would be now. But,
Okay.
Anything else?
So you need myself, Jennifer, and anybody else to leave, Janice?
Yeah, anyone,
It's
any
your only-
management. Yeah, so it's just down to the committee members.
Okay. All right. Then thank you guys very much. It was great seeing you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You too.
Thank you.
All right.